This is not an official podcast of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, NSDAR, and does not necessarily represent the position of the NSDAR. This interview is being conducted for the Daughter Dialogues Oral History Project. The interviewer is Risha Rainey. The narrator is Charlotte Chatfield. Charlotte, can you share with me how old you are, please?
47.
Where were you born?
Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Tell me a little bit about your parents. What did they do and where were they from?
My parents are both from the Orange and Chatham County area of North Carolina. So they're two adjoining counties where Chapel Hill is, Chapel Hill and Pittsboro, respectively. My mother was a laboratory technician for the University of North Carolina. And my father is a veteran and a mechanic.
What are some of your strongest memories from childhood?
Really just being with my family, my immediate family, and I was very fortunate to grow up with both, my mother and my father's family, extended aunts and uncles and grandparents and great-grandparents, on my father's side. I was very fortunate to have my great-grandparents, my father's maternal great-grandparents. I was with them till I was like 16 and 22, 23.
Did you have siblings?
I have two siblings, two brothers.
Did you participate in any particular activities as a child?
I did. Did sports, and pretty much I was a bookworm. Always like on the gifted track in school, band. When I was in high school, I played the flute from 6th to like 10th grade. And then I switched over from being a woodwind instrument player to being on the color guard.
Why did you switch?
Just wanted to do something different. It looked like they were having a lot of fun.
Tell me about your neighborhood and your schools, the racial mixture. What were they?
Well, we were in the generation post integration, so it was evenly mixed. My hometown was very small. I grew up in a town called Pittsboro, which is 16 miles south of Chapel Hill in Chatham County, and we only had 3 schools. We had an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school. So all the kids in the county, in Pittsboro anyway, went to the same 3 schools. So literally, I've known people who I graduated with basically all my life.
Tell me about the universities that you attended.
I attended, initially, I went to North Carolina A&T State University, but then I decided I needed to go find myself, and I found myself doing a lot of different things. Initially. So I dropped out of college initially, and I went to cosmetology school of all places, believe it or not, and didn't really like that too much. So I ended up doing a pharmacy technician program at Durham Technical Community College, which is where I got my pharmacy background from. And then I went to the Navy after that because I guess I was always so very driven in school. I think I was probably burnt out by the time I got to college.
Okay, tell me about your Navy career.
I joined the Navy in 1995. I went in initially with my former husband. It was during the time when there weren't many jobs to be had in healthcare. When the Clintons initially tried their healthcare program, everybody was really shy about hiring, so there weren't really many jobs to be found. So I came up with the wild idea. I was like, hey, let's go to the Navy. So we did together, which was probably not the best idea, but I ended up going to boot camp in Great Lakes, Illinois, which was very, very cold. And once I finished boot camp, I went to air traffic control school in Memphis, Tennessee.
Why did you say it wasn't the best idea?
As a married couple?
I don't know. Tell me what happened.
Just being young, and it's hard enough because I think I got married when I was 22, 23. So I was very young and probably didn't know any better. It's like we were young and idealistic. So we decided to go to the military, and the military is hard enough when you're not married. But when you throw a new marriage, and then because we were a married couple in the Navy, I was stationed on shore duty, he was stationed at sea. And couples just tend to grow apart.
How did you end up in aviation?
Well, that's a funny story. I initially wanted to be a hospital corpsman because of my pharmacy background. I thought that would be a perfect segue. But unfortunately, the needs of the Navy were different. So they decided they didn't have any, what they call were the billets or jobs available for being a hospital corpsman. And as you know, you have to take the ASVAB test.
What is the ASVAB?
The Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude Battery test. So that basically is going to tell you how high you score is going to determine what jobs you get when you're assigned to the military. So the higher the score, the better the job. And so when I was going through the jobs, I didn't have any billets, and they were like, well, do you want to be a mess specialist, which is, basically a cook? I'm like, no. They were like, what about a heavy equipment operator? No, again. So basically, I sat there pretty much for hours for them to find a suitable position. And they finally got down there, like, what about air traffic control? I'm like, well, that's better. Sure, let's go for it. And that's what I decided on.
Were you satisfied with aviation?
I was. It was actually very interesting. I finished air traffic control school, and I learned way too much about aviation and airplanes and how things work, and aviation meteorology and all the FAA rules. And so it was really interesting when I fly, because that's the kind of thing you really can't forget.
You went to school to study computer information systems while you were in the Navy. Why did you decide to explore that avenue?
Well, by the time that came around, I was divorced, and as a single parent, I knew that I could not get out of the Navy without a degree. So I needed to have a bachelor's degree in order to be competitive in the job market.
Were you not interested in staying in aviation or returning to your pharmaceutical background?
Well, that's the funny thing. I did return to my pharmaceutical background soon after that, because I got out of the Navy and I went back home to the Research Triangle Park area. And as I'm sure you know, Research Triangle Park is a hotbed for research. And we have a lot of companies there. So I decided to apply for a job with this company called Quintiles as an entry-level clinical trials associate. And I looked out and I found my mentor who hired me. He was an Air Force veteran and an HBCU grad. And so he hired me for my first job in the industry.
Okay, sorry that I'm still getting stuck on why did you choose the information systems to study if you were passionate about the pharmaceutical industry?
It was a degree that I could complete quickly. I get bored easily with things. And so I feel like my mind is a sponge. So I'm always wanting to learn different things. So, well, let's just go back. My father is a mechanic. And one of the interesting things, I've been turning wrenches and things with him since I was like 5 years old. So I was always wanting to, it was always a thing where I was always with him when he was working on things. So I would always hand him tools and he was like, well, get me this and get me that. And you pick up stuff. And coincidentally, on the ASVAB test, one of my highest scores was in mechanics and tool identification.
Do you think that also landed you in the aviation area, or that just came about because of the conversation you had about what was available?
It came about from what was available, and because I had a high score, I could choose, pretty much whatever I wanted. Because what the Navy does, or any of the armed forces, anybody's trainable. So they tailor their training basically at like an 8th grade level, so everybody can understand. And so they take you from the very basics of everything that you need to learn and just ramp up from there, building on the module before.
Okay, let's go back to your pharmaceutical career. You were at your first job, and how did you progress from there? And were there any particular stories that you remember from your employment?
Well, at this point, I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 20 years now. I started off in 2000 when I got out of the military. So I've been in the industry for 20 years, and it's just, it's been very, very interesting. I've been able to turn a pharmacy technician certificate, combine that with a undergraduate degree, and managed to work my way up from being basically a glorified data entry tech to an associate director at a major biopharmaceutical firm.
What does an associate director do?
We basically at the point where we manage all the processes and governance for the role. It's not I have my boss as a director, so she runs the whole department, but she basically gives us leeway to lead, train, develop associates, and basically do process improvements.
What does your department do?
Well, have you ever read on the drug commercial? So when you're watching the drug commercial and they tell you all the things that are going to happen to you when you take the drug?
Yes, all the disclaimers.
All the disclaimers.
Really bad.
Exactly. Well, those things come across my desk. So when a clinical trial is in process, we have these things called adverse events, and which is that, so basically when you're on the drug, no matter if you stub your toe, trip over the dog, fall down the stairs, it has to be reported because they don't know they want to know if anything was related to the drug. So everything has to be reported.
So do you have to, what you deal with are the reports or
yes, the reported events?
The reported events that consumers or doctors or
the
medical
doctors report
professionals?
From the, anybody can report them if they're serious adverse events. But mainly these are the clinical trial participants working with the physician. So, because they have to check in periodically. So when they go for their visits, the doctor will ask them, has anything happened to you since the last visit? And they say, well, yes, I had a cold, I had the flu, I fell and broke my ankle. All of those things have to be reported.
How did you get into pharmaceuticals, interested in it in the first place?
Well, my mother, it's kind of funny. I was always in a lab with her. So research was never foreign to me because she worked in pediatric endocrinology. I was always with her in the lab. And because I was a healthy patient, they used to recruit me to be a control patient. So I'm here, 7, 8 years old, and they give me $50 per vial of blood so they can use me as a normal subject. So I knew about research and the way things work just from talking to her and being around all the scientists. And because Research Triangle Park is such a hotbed, things were always there. And I learned about the basics of clinical trials when I was in pharmacy tech school.
How do you feel about pharmaceuticals in general? Do you have any type of opinion about how the relationship is between the consumer and the objectives of the pharmaceutical industry, of course, which have to make a profit?
I wish more people would understand, because what we do is we work very hard and we help a lot of people. I wish people would understand that it takes billions of dollars to bring a drug to market. So they should also understand that we're not hiding cures from anybody. We're not, there's no nefarious intent behind the trials. And, they should understand that many, hundreds and thousands of hours go into bringing a drug to market. And a lot of people don't realize most most of the newer, well, say, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but some of the compounds actually fail before they even get to being tested on animals or humans.
Have you run into any source of internal conflict when they were running a trial that maybe you thought wasn't going to be safe and that the subjects might be harmed by the trial?
No, that's not my decision to make. And ultimately, because you have to keep an objective opinion. You can't, be swayed one way or the other. And if the drug is not safe or effective, the FDA is going to pull the trial anyway. And that's the whole, point of why we do what we do. We have to make sure the drugs are both safe and effective.
So when you're not working in pharmaceuticals, what do you like to do other than, I suspect genealogy is one of them.
Yes.
Other than that, what else do you like to do?
I like to read. I like to go to plays in like in New York City and opera, and I miss those things terribly. Primarily, I just like to relax with my husband and my cat, and I would like to go home to visit my family. But other than that, it's pretty laid back, kind of existence.
So you mentioned your husband, you got remarried.
I did.
How did the two of you meet?
In the Navy, actually.
So the Navy was bad for one relationship, but very good as sparking another.
Well, yeah, we were, I was older, at that time. So maturity and, seeing the way things work and, knowing about how life is. But we took it slow. We didn't like immediately jump into another thing. We dated probably for about 5 years before we got married.
You mentioned that you like travel. Are there any particular places that you've traveled to that are stories that stand out to you?
Well, I think probably we've been all over most of the Caribbean, many places in Europe. I've been to the Middle East and Dubai. I have not yet made it to Africa yet, so that's on my list. But I think the most fun trip that and most memorable I had was when I went to Wales in 2018 with my family. Not my immediate family,
the most
but
fun. A lot of people don't consider that to be a top destination on their list.
Well, we hung out in London for a few days, and we met. Well, these are all like genealogy cousins that we met. So I'm also outside of the DAR. I'm descended from people of color, and I found that we were descended from this Welsh family. So we ended up meeting. We have a family Facebook group from all over. And we had already these are some of my Caucasian cousins, and we met online, and we met up in London, and we went to Wales to go see our ancestral estate.
What part of Wales?
It's called Anglesey.
How did you meet these other descendants of the Welsh family?
We all found each other online and by DNA.
Did they know that you were Black?
They did after I told them.
Were they American or European?
They're American.
Where were they from? What part of the country?
Texas, Alabama. I have one cousin that moves around quite frequently, but I know she was somewhere in the Midwest, and I talked to her quite frequently, but I know they also have a home in Florida. But we all just met up and we planned this reunion. When I took my husband with me, it was a blast.
Did they have any issue with your being Black?
Not at all. It was just funny because I pointed out some things to them because I don't know if you're familiar with Ancestry and some of the message boards. Well, my ancestor was named Ransom Myrick.
This is the Welsh gentleman?
No, he was a mixed race person. He was free from my hometown. And
so tell me about him so I can follow this story.
Okay, so my, 4th great grandparents.
On which side?
On my father's maternal side.
Okay.
So this is my grandmother's mother's side. So they were William Smith and Elizabeth Myrick. Free people of color. And Elizabeth's father's name was Duncan Myrick, and his father's name was Ransom Myrick. So these are all free people that I found in the 1850 and 1860 census in my hometown.
How are they free people of color?
I don't know. That's still the burning question. I don't know how they got their freedom.
And what year was this? From
1850. But I have an apprentice bond for both William Smith and Duncan Myrick going back until, I think, 1840 when they were children. So I found Duncan free as a 11-year-old, and William, his future son-in-law, I found him free at 7. And the pleas and quarter sessions minutes and the apprentice bonds. So in my hometown, there was a man named Moses Myrick. He fought during the Revolutionary War. I can't prove all of his connections to him, but he was the main patriarch of that family. So Moses Myrick had lots of sons, and he also had, in my hometown, there was a white man named Ransom Myrick. He eventually ended up moving and going to Tennessee. And so this is where the confusion came in, because people would be talking about my Ransom Myrick thinking it was the same guy. And I said, well, you guys never noticed that the Ransom Myrick in Chatham County was a mulatto? And they had not. So we've been able to, even though I don't have all of the paperwork proving the linkage between the white Ransom and mine, I strongly believe that he may have been the son of this Ransom Myrick. If not the son, maybe a nephew, because the DNA all points back from us being descended from the same family group.
So there were 2 Ransom Myricks.
Yes.
It was a white Ransom Myrick. You think that was more senior, and then there was a Ransom Myrick, possibly a junior?
Exactly.
They were both, how were they related to Moses Myrick?
Moses would have been the grandfather. So the father and grandfather of the senior and the junior.
How does that lead you to the Welsh connection?
Well, they were Welsh, and they all came over from England into Virginia, and then from Virginia into the Carolinas. And then a lot of them actually moved to Alabama. So I found cousins down there, some in the Midwest, some in Texas, because we're always in our DNA results looking up everything and picking up, just putting in Ransom in the search results. I mean, not Ransom, but Myrick in the search results. And they came back, and we just start to map out and see who's descended from, which brother. But ultimately, they all go back to Moses.
Did you find out who was Ransom Myrick? Let's just call him Junior. Did you find out who was his mother?
I have no idea.
But he was just listed as mulatto, but nobody knows who his mother or father is?
No. Only the DNA proves that, yes, he's more than likely he's descended from a Myrick, but we don't know who his mother was. And I assume she may have been an enslaved woman.
So the DNA testing that you took, or you connected to somebody else's DNA testing?
I've tested myself. I've tested my father. I've tested my great-grandmother's niece, who would pretty much be standing in line for that generation since my grandmother's deceased. So I've tested, and I've also found different cousins who have tested, who are descended from the same couple, Elizabeth and William, and they actually have stronger DNA connections to the Myricks than I do. It's just,
and then it all leads back to that Moses Myrick?
It does.
So you connect with these other white relatives that you haven't met before or hadn't met before at that time, and you meet up in London and go to Wales. Is that correct?
Yes.
And why was it such a great experience? What was their connection? How did they relate to you? And what did you find out while you were there?
Well, we have all, ascertained that we are related. And so we're still trying to narrow, we've narrowed down which one of the brothers that I think it was Owen. But these, Myricks go way back to like colonial Virginia. There's a whole book and everything they've written about them. So we're just trying to, narrow down which brother we descend from, and we've pretty much narrowed it down. But of course, it's hard to prove. It's just very funny. The way I talked to one of the cousins quite a bit more than some people I grew up with because we're trying to solve this mystery. But they've been pretty fantastic. We've, of course, the reaction to me when we were in Wales was very funny. They were very nice. They just were. My husband is Caucasian, so they asked him. They were like, "How are you a Myrick?" He's like, "I'm not a Myrick. She is." And so I would explain to them how I'm a Myrick, and that's how we just went from there. Some of the townspeople and everything, but it was a really interesting trip.
The people who reacted that way or asked that question, were these the other cousins or the Welsh people?
The Welsh people, and some of the cousins there at the estate.
What made the trip so fun?
Just Welsh is a very beautiful area of the UK. We were very fortunate because it only rained the one day we were there. But we were invited to the ancestral seat of the Myricks. So it's called Bedorgan Hall. And I'm probably thinking it's probably the only time that they ever would probably do this for anyone. But they threw us a garden party at the estate and had a reception, and it was kind of funny because I was telling my husband, I said I felt like I was on an episode of Downton Abbey 2018 edition, because that's pretty much how it was. You had this large manor house, and because they're very high society people, they had to go to a wedding. So before they excused themselves, they invited some of the townspeople to take us to our ancestral church, which is like one of those medieval churches that was built. I don't know how old it is, but it's probably 900s or 8 or 900s, AD. So I was asking one of the young ladies, I said, "Well, how do you like the estate? This is your first." She was like, "This is my first time here. We've never been in here before."
What are some of your other free people of color in your family?
Actually, they're all related to the Myricks. So they were either Smiths, Myricks, and then all the associated families. I think I have from that side, about 6 lines of all people who intermarried with the free people in that area. There may be more. I just haven't found them yet. And I found them coincidentally because I'm in a Facebook group of DNA descendants of free people of color from Orange, Chatham, Alamance, and the surrounding counties. And, from when I was doing my research, I'm like, well, wait a minute. I have, cousins who have tribal cards to some of the local tribes. And I was getting frustrated because I'm like, well, hey, if I'm related to all of you multiple times on different lines, and you have your free people, I hadn't found mine yet. And I didn't realize I wasn't looking back far enough. And William Smith, the husband of Elizabeth Myrick, was the key. There was a lady, I'm so glad she did this, but there's a GenWeb website, and NC GenWeb, and she basically transcribed all of the free people of color from the 1850 and 1860 census and put them on a website and highlighted them in red. So all you had to do was click on the website and scroll down and read the names. And I was looking them one day and I was scrolling and I got down to a boy named William Smith, born in 1838. And I'm like, wait a minute. My William Smith was born in 1838, and that was the key. That's how I found my free people of color.
Did you find out how the other free people of color that you identified, how did they get the mixed race lineage or heritage?
William Smith was married to Elizabeth Myrick. So, because of course, with the laws, the free people of color could only marry other free people of color. They couldn't marry enslaved people, and they could not, of course, obviously could not marry them with the white people in the town. So they pretty much had to stick to a certain core group of families. So the Mitchells, the Myricks, the McClanahans, the Smiths, And I'm sure I'm forgetting another one, but that's how those families came about.
Were you able to pinpoint how they became interracial?
No, not yet. Other than,
Is it correct that they were interracial?
yes, definitely. There's no doubt about that. But one thing I've been able to pinpoint is there's a very big contingent of triracial people in the area. Triracial being Black, Caucasian, and Native American. And you probably wouldn't. A lot of people, it's kind of funny. They always talk about having a Cherokee ancestor. I'm like, well, not from where we're from. In our area, we have the Lumbee, we have the Eno, we have the Occaneechi, we have the Howard-Saponi. And then I have some cousins who are in the Occaneechi band of the Saponi Nation, which is in the next county over. And then I have some other cousins who are descended from, I think, the Eno, and they're enrolled in the Saponi Nation of Ohio.
How do you feel about all that you learned about your free people of color ancestry and tracing back to Wales?
I thought it was pretty fantastic. I mean, just to be able to do that, and the magic of DNA and the technology is, it's pretty fascinating.
Does it mean anything to you that your ancestors were free people of color?
It does, but I don't think, because the free people in North Carolina had such a hard time, particularly after the Nat Turner Rebellion, they were pretty much just stuck in the middle with very, few rights after, things were stripped away from them, because they had the vote for a while and then they didn't. So a lot of the people ended up moving from North Carolina to Indiana to go out there with the Quakers.
Do you know if they participated in any of the free people of color settlement?
I'm sure they did, because I'm finding some DNA connections to them. It was just, we're still uncovering a lot.
How did you even get into genealogy?
Well, I fell into it by accident, sort of. About back in 2011, 23andMe was doing a push to get more African Americans into their database, and they gave away 10,000 free test kits. And I grabbed one of those for myself.
Why were you even interested in doing the 23andMe test kit?
I'm a researcher.
Well, how did you get interested in research? You were interested, or you were exposed to research or laboratory through your mother. How did you become interested in researching family lineage in particular?
Well, when I got my DNA results back, because I'm not sure if you're familiar with the way the test kits work at the different companies, but at 23andMe, they give you your autosomal results, which is, all your DNA matches, your cousins, your admixture. But you also get this thing called a haplogroup. And my haplogroup came back European. That wasn't a shock, but it was interesting to see it on paper, and I wanted to know more.
What made you get that test kit? I know they were giving it away for free, but
Exactly.
Not everybody's interested in swabbing their cheek and finding out where people from centuries ago came from in their family lineage. Why were you interested in finding that out?
Well, because people would always ask me, because as you probably, if you've seen my picture, I'm brown skin, but I have really long hair. And my hair is probably straightened almost waist length. So it doesn't compute with people. And it's very fine and curly, because I'm natural. So it's a kind of a silky texture. So people would always ask me, they were like, what are you? And I'm like, I'm Black. They're like, no, you're not. Not all Black. I'm like, you have to be Native American. I'm like, no, I'm Black. Both my parents are Black. And so, because you always get those kind of questions, I was just interested to see exactly what would come out. And when I saw the European haplogroup, which I knew, I wasn't really big into genealogy at the time or knew much about how it worked. But when it came back that my haplogroup was H1 and European, I was like, huh, okay. Well, that proves what I already knew. I wanted to find out how far back I could take that.
Did it show any American Indian heritage?
Very little, not as much as I thought, but it was there. It came up with a trace amount. So I'm like, well, that wasn't a surprise, but I didn't know, and I still don't know how to go about proving it. Other than I know I have cousins who have tribal affiliations, I haven't been able to prove mine yet.
Did it solve the mystery of your hair?
Sort of. I was like, okay, well, that didn't, because I always assumed it came from my great grandmother or my great grandmother. She was a mulatto. She was a mixed race person, and I said, well, no. And I said, Mom, my hair is different from yours. My hair is more like Dad's. And when I went around visiting all my different relatives and I met people on my dad's paternal side, I met my hair twin. When I went to go meet them, and I finally saw one of my cousins, and she had her hair pulled back just like mine in a bun. And I said, hey, your hair is exactly like mine. I said, when you have it out, how long is it? She said, well, it's down my waist. And her mother was like, everybody on this side of the family has hair like this. So I'm like, oh.
And where did that come from?
Race mixing.
Do you know the stories about that?
I have some ideas, but I haven't done as much research on my father's side. I will say, you really can't go by phenotype and what people look like to determine how much admixture they have from one to the next. My father is actually a few shades darker than me. My mother is fair skinned, and my father has more European ancestry than my mother does.
Which side is your Revolutionary War patriot?
That is my mother's maternal side. My direct maternal line is European.
That's where you first thought your hair came from.
Yeah, I had an idea. Everybody always assumed that's what we came from. I was like, well, maybe.
And then you found out that your father, who is darker skinned than your mother, it's probably coming from that side.
Yes, because I met relatives who look a lot like me, and then everybody has his hair the same hair texture on my father's paternal side. My father's hair is actually very curly, and as he's gotten older, his hair is stick straight, and as I get older, my hair is turning stick straight, which is insane.
How did you know that you had a Revolutionary War patriot?
Well, once I started to research my great grandmother, and I found her death certificate, and I started to go back. Once I figured out who her mother was, I just kept going. And I ended up at not one, but 3 Revolutionary War patriots on that side.
Tell me about the one that you used to apply with for the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Well, as I stated earlier, when I got my DNA test done, my maternal haplogroup, which traces your maternal ancestry unchanged from mother to daughter, going all the way back to the beginning of when the people came out of Africa, it came back to be H1, which is a European haplogroup. So I knew I wasn't looking for a woman of African descent. And so I started to do the research with my great grandmother, and I ended up, she was born in 1871. And when I started doing my research, I found her death certificate, and it had that her mother was a Mary Pendergrass, no relation to Teddy. Mary Pendergrass, and her father's name was Abe Horton. And I go to the 1870 census, and so I go to the 1870 census, and there is a Pendergrass family, white, living next to a Horton family, black.
And then where did that lead you?
Well, down the rabbit hole after that, because it was really hard to find So Mary Pendergrass was my third great grandmother. She was a white woman. And Abe Horton, I think he was a formerly enslaved person. I haven't found much on him. But
So you think that Mary, a white woman, had a relationship with a black man that was formerly enslaved?
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that came about? Do you know if it was a formal marriage or relationship?
That's the $100,000 question. I'm not sure. I don't know if it was consensual. I don't know if it was not. All I do know, because my whole question was, how did Abraham, which is my great 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 grandfather, how did he manage to stay alive after impregnating a white girl? They ended up marrying other people, and so I lost her after.
Well, how do you know that they were a couple, or that they
don't know they were a couple. All I have is the DNA. And what was on my grandmother's great great grandmother's death certificate, it clearly listed her parents as Abe Horton and Mary Jane Pendergrass. I don't know because with the laws and everything, they couldn't marry each other, so they ended up marrying other people.
Did your family know this before, or this is something that you learned?
Well, it's kind of funny. Because when I was doing the research and I was talking to my grandmother, who is 92, by the way, love her dearly. She has been such a great sport through all of this, because this is my mother's mother. She's taken DNA tests at every company. I've tested her from 23andMe to Ancestry to Family Tree DNA. And she's been such a great sport. And it's really helpful because you actually get that generation there. And the DNA proves, yes, we are Pendergrasses. So it's just really interesting, finding all these connections.
How does that lead back to your Revolutionary War patriot?
Well, the first one that I've proven and gotten on paper. So Mary Jane Pendergrass, her father's name was Islet Pendergrass, and her mother's name was Martha Durham. And Martha Durham, I traced back, and that's my patriot that I joined under was William Lindsay Durham.
How did you know that William Lindsay Durham participated in the Revolutionary War?
I kept going back from Martha to her father to, I don't know, how many more generations is that? I think 2 more, and I found the paperwork. Because it's, pretty much, as you know, Durham, North Carolina, these are the same people that the town is named after. So my patriot is William Durham Sr. The namesake of Durham, North Carolina was Bartlett Snipes Durham. He was a descendant of William Durham Jr.
How did you feel about this, that you traced your ancestry back to someone who contributed to the founding of this nation and its cause for freedom, along with naming the town after them?
Well, the town came about because he donated, Bartlett Snipes Durham donated land for the train station, and they called it Durham Station, and then it ultimately became the city and county of Durham. But it was interesting, and because where I grew up was very colonial, so my hometown that I spent most of my time in as a child was founded in 1770. Pittsburgh. Chapel Hill was founded in 1772. I'm sorry, 1752. And so you're right there in the middle of all of that history. You take it for granted as a kid because you don't know. And nobody certainly was going to tell us, hey, if you had told me when I was a kid that I was descended from 3 Revolutionary War patriots that I can prove and a bunch that I can't just because I don't have the paperwork, I would have said you were nuts. Because the only narrative that we get primarily as African Americans is you got brought over, during the Middle Passage, Lincoln freed the slaves, Martin Luther King, God bless America, have a good day. They don't tell us that there were free people from the time prior to the revolution, and that we had ancestors who fought during the war, who were the forgotten patriots and who did contribute to the fact, even though I don't have one of those and I haven't found one yet, does not negate the fact that we were here. And I think a lot more people would have a different view of the contribution that people of color have given to this country if they knew more of the history. Which is why I'm so glad that you're doing this project, because it gives so much of a different view, because people don't know. And they don't think, because I've gotten different reactions when I tell people who my patriot is, and they were like, but you're from Durham. Who's your patriot? I'm like, I just told you. And you see the wheels start to spin and they, can't figure out, and they automatically assume through slavery. And I'm like, no, it's not.
And did you blow their mind even more and tell them, well, actually, it was a black man that had a relationship with a white woman, and that's how I came through that line?
Oh, yes. It's always amusing.
How does that go? Who are you telling?
Well, I mean, everybody who wants to know, because you see the question on their faces, or they, automatically assume that I had another, there was, in my particular chapter, I joined initially one of the chapters in Durham. And this is a 100-year-old chapter with a lot of, older. So if you can imagine the type of history that's there. And there was another woman of color who was in the chapter. Everybody always assumed we were related. And I'm like, how can I be related to her? She's not from North Carolina at all. Actually, we just met. And it was we always had a running joke, because we would go places and people would assume we were mother and daughter, and we would just go with it. Because, we couldn't possibly be two people in the same chapter and we had to be related. It can't possibly be two of us
that don't even know each other.
Mm-hmm. Or didn't know each other until we met at the DAR.
What made you even seek membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution you joined in March 2017?
I thought it was important to document, my family history. My family, I don't think they understand. My mom actually thought it was hilarious. Because my mom is of the baby boomer generation, and she's kind of granola hippie type. So she thought it was just like the funniest thing that I joined the Daughters of the American Revolution. And I said, Mom, I said, what's so funny? I said, I joined under you. I said, did you tell your friends I joined under your family?
And what was so funny?
I think she just, being from that generation and growing up in the civil rights movement, that the fact that, one of her children had joined this organization under her family line was probably just like one of the most foreign things she's ever heard.
Well, did she ever consider joining? Did you try to get her to join?
I'm trying to get her to join. What I may have to do, because I want to do the Cameo Club, and I've talked to a few of my cousins. They have one that may be interested. I may just have to get my grandmother to do it.
Is your mother just refusing?
No, she hasn't refused. I don't think I've really pressed her enough about it, to say, hey, I want you to join.
What are you doing about the other two patriots that you said you found but haven't submitted for what they call a supplemental application to add to your lineage in the DAR records?
Well, the one would be easy. One would be Matthew Durham. That would be the father of William. So that's pretty much an easy thing. But the other one would be John Pendergrass, which was an ancestor of Mary's father.
Do you know much about him? So he has to be
established as a new patriot. I know a lot about him. It was just, tying myself to this family on paper was very. It was very. I ended up finding out a lot, and coincidentally, my grandmother still lives on the same side of town that all these people settled in. Like, when I literally say right down the road, she's literally right down the road.
What do you know about the Pendergrass story?
Actually, no, that's a lot more interesting than the Durham side. The Durham, I had a lot more paperwork from there. So when I got ultimately found all these people and got all my paperwork together and go join the DAR. Ended up having like a folder with proof, probably like an inch thick. And when I went to the registrar and we did all my paperwork, I said, hey, you need to send all this in. She's like, no, I don't have anything. I said, no, yes, you do. I'm Black. Trust me, you need to send it in. And she didn't. And my application got kicked back because they needed more clarification. So I sat on the application probably for about 6 months because I was irritated because I knew I was right. And had I sent all my initial everything that I already found with the explanations ahead of time, I would have been in, 6 months earlier. And
why do you think that she didn't send everything in?
Well, just, naivete, I think. Saying, well, this is enough. And I was like, no, you have to explain this. People are not going to understand. And that's exactly what happened. When I got my, they called it the air letter back, and they asked me to explain. They were like, well, this is unusual. They were asking for marriage licenses. And I'm like, again, this is a white woman. This is a Black man. There's not going to be a marriage license. I was like, interracial marriage wasn't legal in the United States until 1965 with Love v. Virginia. Not going to have a marriage license. And so I bet, there were some things that, did seem kind of unusual. But they were questioning like my great grandmother's death certificate. They were like, well, how do you know? I was like, do you think, because they were questioning the informant given the information. And I said, well, she was my great-great-grandmother's daughter. You don't think she knew who her grandparents were? And then I used that along with the census records, showing the people living right beside each other. And I said, well, there's a, clear something here with these, families living adjacent to each other. And also I had a probate record. So Mary Jane Pendergrass lived with a spinster aunt, Jenny. Not only, so you have to if you look at my great-great-grandparents' marriage license, her mother gave her permission to get married. She signed it, Mary Pendergrass, but she had gotten married by that time. And the genealogist was asking us why she's under a different name. I said, well, even though she's married to another person, she was still Mary Pendergrass. That's her maiden name. Her daughter's also name is Pendergrass. I said she had to have that kind of relationship. And on the, how on the marriage licenses, they, everybody's designated by color. Lavinia, which is my great-great-grandmother, her husband are both, listed as colored. Doesn't say anything about her mother. So that was clue number one. And they got married at the white relative's house. Not only that, but 5 years after the spinster aunt died, my great-great-grandparents were living in the house. And I found a probate record from one of the cousins who was kind of salty.
You mean her children, her mixed race children were living in the house?
Yes, my great-great-grandmother and her very Black husband. He was it's kind of funny because my great-great-grandmother was very fair-skinned. She could pass. And her husband was a really short, really dark Black man.
So Lavinia could have passed, and she chose to marry a Black man?
She did.
They moved into Mary Pendergrass's house.
Yeah, there was the house was owned by they got married there. And then 5 years later, I found them listed in a probate record when the spinster aunt died. It was Mary Pendergrass's aunt's house. So the aunt was a spinster. And a lot of the children lived there with her. Like her brother's children and different things like that. They all lived there at the house with the spinster aunt. And that's where we find Mary as a 14-year-old in 1870.
And you were telling me about other records that you found. You found the probate record and what else?
Well, the probate record, basically, there was a letter to the probate judge, basically besmirching the house. Basically, there's something going on down there, but because the spinster aunt died without a will. And so he writes a letter to the probate judge basically saying, Um, there's a lot going on down at that house, but everybody knows there's nothing going on down there but a bunch of bastard kids. And
Is that what the letter actually says?
It did.
Those words?
Those words. So when I was going through her probate record, I found 2 letters. The first letter was from the clerk of Superior Court in Orange County, asking to be released as administrator over the estate, and there were some questionable things that he called the children. And then the second letter was the one where the cousin of Jane Pendergrass was questioning the Rob and Lavinia's residence 5 years after the fact, after the spinster aunt passed away. So Rob and Lavinia were still on the property 5 years after the death. And this is the piece of the proof that I used for my application, tying Rob and Lavinia to this family. Because if they, didn't have some kind of a relationship, why are they living in the property for 5 years and nobody said anything until 5 years later?
And what did it say?
Well, that letter basically said, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, November 1st, 1897. To the 4 men in grand jury of Orange Superior Court, fall term 1897. Gentlemen, this is to notify you that Mrs. Jenny Pendergrass, who lived on the Pittsboro Road 3 miles from Chapel Hill, died about 5 years ago, seized and possessed of a tract of land, and no one has administered on her estate. I am informed that in such cases where there are minor legalities, as is the case in this instance, it becomes your duty to report it to the judge and his to appoint an administrator. Respectively submitted, G. N. Pendergrass. And then there was a second page, and the second page stated, you can find the land listed for taxation in Chapel Hill Township. There are about 40 acres. A Negro, Rob Bynum, lives on it and lists it as his property and pays no tax. She also had personal property at the time of her death, which has been surrendered. Almost any person living in or south of Chapel Hill can give you the facts of the case, respectively GNP.
What is that letter really saying, and what does it mean to you?
My only interest in this particular case was that my great-great-grandfather was listed in the probate record. And there was another piece of information that I could use to tie my family with theirs. She looked up all of the children, including my great-great-great-grandmother, and they were her brother's children. If their brothers had outside children and they may or may not have been married, that's where they ended up. The fact that someone would feel so strongly as to write a letter like that, I think it may have been also a racial thing. How dare this black man, dare to, live on this property that this white woman lived. But I honestly believe if they had been white, there wouldn't have been anything said about it. The guy I told you about, the guy matched by DNA?
Yes.
That the guy writing this letter was his ancestor. But that was one of the things I had to use to, when I wrote back to the genealogist, I had to explain to her the nuances of Southern genealogy. I was like, some things they admit, some things they don't. But ultimately, they know who their relatives are. And my great-great-grandfather had a lot of land, not just that, in the area. He was very successful. I don't know how because he was formerly an enslaved person. But he had lots and lots of land, not just what they may have inherited or gotten from the Pendergrasses. So it was I thought it was very interesting.
Do you know if Mary Pendergrass had other children with her new marriage?
Oh, she did. She had about, I want to say 5 additional children.
Did they ever live in the house too?
They did. Well, after, they moved. But one of the most interesting pieces in the 1930 census, my grandmother was 2 years old. You see my grandmother living with her parents, Rob Bynum and Lavinia Pendergrass living a few houses down from them, and a few houses up from there. Guess who was there? Mary, her mother. They were still living in the same area. And I use that as also the circumstantial evidence for my case.
We didn't talk about their actual service of your Revolutionary War ancestors. I know you applied and were approved for one, and there's a couple of other patriots that you're working on. Tell me about their actual service in the Revolutionary War.
Well, for the Durhams, I think they just I think William provided a substitute. So he paid someone or furnished someone to fight on his behalf. I'm not sure what his father did, Matthew, but John Pendergrass actually did fight in the Revolution.
Do you know where he fought?
It was in around Orange County. I have to pull his service record, but he was in a local company there because I have when his widow applied for the pension, but I don't know the particulars of that one.
When you were thinking about joining the Daughters of the American Revolution, did you have any hesitation joining this organization that had a past history of racial discrimination?
No, and I'll tell you why. I don't know. Maybe it's because our generation was the generation post-integration. We all just, went to school with everybody. And so it was never, I think our generation was pretty much the first when they told us that we could do anything with anybody. So other than, I had friends who were like, oh, why would you want to join that organization? I'm like, because I can. And I think it's important. Because we do so much outreach in the DAR, whether it's for veterans or new citizens who do the swearing in ceremonies and different outreach. I think it's important to have somebody, people of color, because we do outreach for people of color. Why not be there and to serve and to document our lineage?
Do you tell other people that you're a member? And if so, how do they react?
I do. Because they ask me what my hobbies are. I said, well, genealogy, history, things like that, volunteer with the DAR. And they're like, wow, that's, a lot of people are interested. They think it's, pretty cool. Some people, it just depends. Because I am a genealogy buff. The one thing I like about the DAR is the fact that, people are willing to talk about their ancestry. And that's where you can go and say, hey, this is what I found. Look at this great, my new discovery, because people are genuinely interested in hearing what you have to say.
Does anyone ever bring up the topic of Marian Anderson and
Yes.
the DAR not allowing her to sing in Constitution Hall in 1939 because of her race? And
They do.
What do they say? What do you say and what do they say?
Well, they said, well, you know what they did to Marian Anderson? And I said, yes, but they also, do you know the other fact they brought her back eventually? She did sing and they gave her a stamp. But they had the ceremony for her, I guess some of her relatives and things there. I said, so they did the best they could to make amends, but we can't, so I think it's also unfair to apply 2020 standards to things that happened back in 1939. So everybody was racist back then, or at least they seemed to be. So why is this a surprise?
Did you have a new member welcome ceremony?
I did.
Did you feel any particular emotion during the time that you were standing in front of the room and being formally accepted as a new member in the Daughters of the American Revolution?
Well, I felt pride, because I'm there, representing for my, great-great-grandmother and her lineage, just to get it out there and on paper. And then, I guess with validation, because, people always want to tell people of color to go back to Africa, go back here, go back there. And I'm like, well, my family's been here since before the revolution, well before. So if I can tell, if anything, I can tell you to go back to where you came from.
You also mentioned that you wanted to validate your historical perspective that a lot of people assume that Black Americans were just enslaved. And
yes.
You said it's much more than that?
It is much more than that. I mean, I'm not discounting. I have ancestors who were enslaved Africans, free people of color, and Europeans. So it's complicated. It's messy. but that's what makes us Americans.
Have you tried to recruit other people to join?
I have. I think I've actually been pretty successful at a few events. I am an associate member of the chapter in New York. And when I was in Brooklyn, we went to some ceremony at one of the cemeteries, and I was talking to a lady, and I think she may have been interested in joining. So all the time.
Was that a white person or a black person?
It was a black person. A white person. I'm sorry.
Oh, a white person. So you're also recruiting white people to join, not just black potential members.
Right. Why not? In particular, people, because I am a veteran, people who have connections to the military.
You're also a member of a chapter where you grew up. Is that correct?
I am.
Why did you decide to have two memberships, one in North Carolina in Chapel Hill and one in New York City?
Well, I moved. So I live in New Jersey now. I kept my membership in North Carolina because I'm homesick. I love New York City.
Would it not have been more convenient to join a chapter? You currently live in New Jersey.
Well, I'm an associate member. But no, they're a very fun chapter. They do a lot of interesting things there.
Have you been involved in your home chapter or the chapter in which you have associate membership?
I have. Before I moved, I was a chapter officer. I think what was I doing? Historian? So, and I would have continued that a lot longer had I not moved, but
How did you end up becoming a chapter officer?
Need. We're a small chapter, and the position was available, and they asked me to do it, so I said yes.
How did you enjoy that experience being a leader of the chapter?
It was interesting. This particular chapter is different from most in the area because most of the membership is junior and people who still work. So that was it was a good fit for me. And so I was happy to pitch in because it was a little bit of a different dynamic than normal.
What does being a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution mean to you?
It means a lot, as far as I said earlier, validation. I'm a history buff, to say, hey, yes, my family was here prior to the revolution and we rendered aid on behalf of this country. As a veteran, I like the fact that patriotism is one of their main focuses. So it gives me a place where I can continue to do more patriotic things. And since we do a lot of veteran outreach, I really enjoy that.
Does it make you feel any different as an American being a member of the DAR?
It does. Unfortunately, there's a lot of being an American during all the uncertainty and the different things that are going on right now is kind of gives you some not really an uneasy feeling because I love being American. I can't think of it being anything else but American because that's what we are. And so it gives you a place to learn about flag code and flag etiquette and patriotism and what that means. Because if I'm going back to the revolution, I probably had a relative fight in almost every war since then.
Does it change your sense of identity?
Yes and no. Because I identify as a Black woman. That's never going to change. But knowing that I descend from a white woman, it kind of gives you a different outlook because sometimes in this genealogy world, things can get kind of messy and people will say, well, I don't really care about my European heritage. I don't want to focus on that. I don't want to, know about people who may have been enslaved or any of my ancestors who may have, been slave owners and been my ancestors. And I'm like, well, if it's part of you, how can you dismiss it? And that's the thing, because I can't dismiss my third great grandmother. If she wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here. And I can say the same for, a lot of the other ancestors that we had. My mother basically put a picture going from my daughter, from me to my mother, grandmother, great grandmother, and then Lavinia, all in a little tree. And we all look alike. my husband, he's funny. He's like, now you know where you got your Reese Witherspoon chin from. You know, have Reese Witherspoon's chin tilts to the side when she smiles. My chin does the exact same thing. So we can't get away from genetics. But I do have a funny story. I met one of my cousins in person.
Which cousins? Which
one
line?
Of the Pendergrass cousins. So we were at it was a genealogy conference at NC State University, and I was the secretary of the Durham Orange County Genealogical Society. So we were there, and I was talking to one of my board members. He was a really sweet guy. He actually goes to church when I went to the Sunday service at my great-great-great-grandmother's church. So I pulled up my matches. I typed in the Pendergrass, and it came up, and a guy, his picture came up. And Joe was like, "That's your cousin?" He's like, "He's here. I know him." I said, "Really?" I said, "You have to go introduce me." So he walked all the way around the convention center, and he introduced me to this guy. And he, of course, he was shocked. He's
and
like,
the guy was white.
He was white. He's like, "Well, this is your cousin." And he was like, "How? Who's your ancestor?" I said, "My sixth great grandfather was John Pendergrass." He said, "The one that fought in the Revolution." I said, "The one and the same." And I showed him how. I basically said, "Well, my ancestor was Mary Jane Pendergrass, a white woman. Here she is in 1870, right next door, black man. She had a baby with him." In the story.
And how did he react?
I mean, he didn't say he seemed shocked, but he was actually really cool. We corresponded a little bit after that by email, but I mean, because you can't dispute DNA. It has us down. It's like third or fourth cousins.
How did you feel about telling him this?
Oh, it was. I thought it was funny, but he was a good sport. Now I did have one set. I did reach out to some descendants of my grandma Lou's half siblings. Now they did act kind of funny, and I did get ghosted by them because I don't think they knew that their great 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 grandmother had a baby with a black man.
And these were white descendants.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't want to hear it.
I don't think they wanted to hear it. They were like, "What? Not me, Ma." I was like, and from what I understand now. I've been told by my family members that my great-great-grandmother had a brother. And I'm like, the DNA matches, but I haven't been able to prove.
Lavinia had a brother.
Mm-hmm. His name was Madison. And we all match up to Madison's relatives. And so that got my, spinning a lot too, because I'm like, wait a minute. So not only did she have one black child, but she had two. But I haven't been able to prove Madison's parentage. She only signed off on Lavinia. As far as on her marriage license, that I have concrete proof that, she acknowledged that was her child. And Lavinia got married off at 13.
To Rob.
A
black man.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think Mary was proud?
I don't know. I mean, but they had to have some kind of relationship in 1930. She was living 2 doors down from Lavinia. I don't know. I just think it's funny how, we're all at each other's throats and, all the unrest and everything. And I'm like, we all related.